I used to think graves were the quietest places in the world until the morning I saw 10 men in black suits standing around my father's tombstone like silent statues. I remember the cold air brushing across the cemetery lawn and the faint sound of wind moving through the trees as I walked up the gravel path with a small bouquet of white lilies in my hands. It was just after 8 in the morning, the same time I visited every year, because my dad used to say mornings were honest, they didn't pretend to be anything else, but that morning nothing felt honest at all. From 50 feet away, I could already see them, 10 men, tall, broad-shouldered, perfectly still, their dark suits sharp against the pale stone of the cemetery. They weren't talking, they weren't looking around, they were simply standing there, forming a quiet circle around the gray marble headstone that carried my father's name, Daniel Carter, loving father and loyal friend. My steps slowed the closer I got because people didn't gather around my father's grave. He had been a simple man, a mechanic who spent most of his life fixing engines in a small garage just off Route 9, the kind of man who came home with grease on his hands and a tired smile. But the men standing there didn't look like customers from a repair shop. They looked like the kind of men you only see stepping out of black cars in movies, the kind that move when someone powerful tells them to move. One of them noticed me first. His eyes shifted slightly, then the others followed. Not threatening, not curious, just aware, like they had been expecting me. I stopped about 10 yards away, my fingers tightening around the flowers. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to be. "I think you might have the wrong grave." None of them answered. The only sound was the wind brushing over the grass. And then from somewhere behind them, I heard the slow crunch of tires on gravel. Every head in that circle turned at the same moment. A long black car rolled to a quiet stop near the path. The door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, calm, dressed in a dark coat that moved slightly in the breeze. Even before he started walking, the air around him felt different. The 10 men straightened just enough to make it clear who they were waiting for. I had seen his face before, not in person, but on the evening news. The name alone had a reputation that filled rooms. Adrian Volkov, the man people whispered about when they thought no one else could hear. He walked across the grass without hurry until he reached my father's grave. The men parted to give him space, and I stood there frozen about 20 feet away as he placed a single white rose gently against the marble stone. He didn't look at me at first. His eyes stayed on the name carved into the granite. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost respectful. "I'm late," he said. 20 years late. My heart began to pound, because nothing about this moment made sense. My father fixed cars and changed tires. He wasn't the kind of man connected to people like Adrian Volkov, and yet the most feared man in the city was standing in front of his grave like he owed him something. After a few seconds, Adrian finally turned his eyes toward me, calm, steady, studying my face as if confirming something he had waited years to see. Then he said the sentence that changed everything: "Your father saved my life." I stood there staring at Adrian Volkov because my mind refused to accept the sentence he had just spoken. The wind moved gently through the cemetery, but the silence between us felt heavy like the air before a storm. "My father saved your life," the words repeated in my head again and again, and none of them made sense. My father, Daniel Carter, had been many things: patient, stubborn, kind, sometimes annoyingly optimistic. But he was not the kind of man who crossed paths with someone like Adrian Volkov. I tightened my grip around the lilies until the paper wrapping crinkled softly. "You must be mistaken," I finally said, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. "My father fixed cars for a living. He worked 6 days a week in a small garage off Route 9. Adrian did not react with surprise or irritation. Instead, he studied my face with a calm expression, as if he had expected that answer for a very long time. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small folded photograph. The paper looked old, like it had traveled through years in someone's wallet. He stepped closer and handed it to me. The men around the grave remained perfectly still, like shadows that had learned how to breathe. I unfolded the photograph carefully and felt my chest tighten. The picture showed a roadside somewhere at night, headlights glowing in the distance, a damaged car resting crooked near the shoulder, and beside it, 2 men. One of them was younger, dressed in a dark jacket with a serious expression. The other man had grease stains on his shirt sleeves and a familiar crooked smile. Even in the faded photograph, I recognized him immediately. It was my father. I looked up slowly. Adrian spoke. Before I could ask anything, it happened 20 years ago on a highway outside the city. He said calmly, "There was an accident. My car stopped working, and the road was empty except for one pickup truck that pulled over." He paused for a moment, his eyes drifting Back to the headstone. Your father stepped out of that truck, Adrian continued. He did not ask who I was. He did not ask what had happened. He simply helped a stranger on the side of the road. I looked again at the photograph, the edges worn from time. My father never told me about this, I whispered. Adrian nodded slightly. That was the kind of man he was, he said quietly. He helped people without asking questions. The wind moved through the cemetery again, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out from the trees. I felt a strange mixture of confusion and disbelief building inside my chest. If this was true, then my father had met the most powerful man in the city and never said a word about it. Why would he hide something like that? I lifted my eyes back toward Adrian and asked the question that would not leave my mind. If my father helped you 20 years ago, then why are you here now? Adrian looked down at the stone for a moment before answering. Because I made a promise that night, he said slowly. And I have been paying that debt ever since. I blinked in confusion. Paying a debt? How? Adrian looked back at me, and the calm in his voice did not change. I have been protecting you. I felt the ground shift under my thoughts the moment Adrian Volkov said those words. I have been protecting you. The sentence sounded calm, almost ordinary, but nothing about it felt ordinary to me. I stared at him, trying to decide whether this was some strange misunderstanding, because no one protects someone for 20 years without them knowing. That only happens in stories, not in real life. Yet Adrian stood there in front of my father's grave, speaking as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I shook my head slowly. That does not make sense, I said, my voice barely louder than the wind. I would have noticed something like that. Adrian gave a quiet breath that almost sounded like a small laugh, not mocking, just patient. No, Emily, he said softly, you would not have noticed, because the point of protection is that you never see it. He stepped slightly to the side and glanced toward the line of black cars parked along the gravel path. The men around the grave remained silent, but I suddenly became aware of how carefully they watched the surroundings, not nervous, not tense, just observant, like people who were used to noticing things others ignored. 20 years ago, Adrian continued, your father helped a stranger on the side of a road. He could have driven away. He could have ignored the situation like most people do, but he did not. He stayed until everything was safe again, and before he left I asked him why he helped me. Adrian paused and looked down at the engraved name on the stone. Daniel Carter. Your father said something simple, something I never forgot. He said, if someone needs help and you can help them, then you do it. That is all. I felt my throat tighten, because that sounded exactly like something my father would say. He believed kindness was not complicated. He used to tell me that the world was already difficult enough without people making it harder for each other. Adrian continued, speaking slowly, as if remembering every detail from that night. I offered him money, he said. I offered him connections, opportunities, things most people would not refuse, but your father only smiled and shook his head. He told me he did not want anything from me except one promise. I frowned slightly. What promise? Adrian looked at me again, and his voice grew even quieter. He asked me to remember that kindness still existed in the world. He said one day I might meet someone who would need the same help he gave me, and when that day came I should not look away. I stared at Adrian, trying to process what he was telling me. So you protected me because of that promise? Adrian nodded, not immediately, but steadily. Over time, he said, when your father passed away, I made another decision. I decided that his kindness would never be forgotten, so I made sure you had opportunities. One, made sure problems disappeared before they reached you, and I made sure no one ever tried to take advantage of you. The wind brushed across the cemetery again, and I suddenly remembered small moments from my life, things that had always seemed like luck. The scholarship that appeared when college tuition felt impossible, the landlord who suddenly lowered the rent when my mother struggled after the funeral, the job interview that turned into an offer. Even though I felt completely unprepared, my chest felt tight as the pieces slowly began connecting in ways I had never imagined before. You were saying all of that was you? I asked quietly. Adrian did not answer immediately. He simply watched me with calm, steady eyes. Then he said, not everything, Emily. Some good things in life belong to you and your own strength. But when the world tried to close a door, I made sure another one stayed open. I looked back at my father's grave, and the lilies in my hands suddenly felt heavier than before, because for the first time I realized something about the man who raised me. His kindness had not ended the day he died. It had been quietly shaping my life for 20 years. And I had never even known it. I kept staring at my father's name carved into the gray marble, because it suddenly felt like the ground beneath my memories had shifted. The man I thought I understood my entire life now seemed larger somehow, not different, just Deeper, like there were quiet chapters of his life that he had never needed to explain. The lilies were still in my hands, and after a moment I stepped forward and placed them gently at the base of the tombstone beside the single white rose. Adrian had left. The two flowers looked strangely peaceful together against the stone. I folded my arms lightly against the cool morning air and tried to steady my thoughts. "You have been watching my life for 20 years, I said slowly. "That sounds less like protection and more like surveillance." Adrian did not seem offended by the word. He simply nodded once. "That is a fair way to describe it," he admitted, "but the intention was never control, only protection." I turned toward him again, studying his face more carefully now up close. He looked exactly like the photographs people whispered about online, calm, precise, unreadable. Yet there was something else in his expression when he looked at my father's grave, something that felt almost like respect. "My father never told me any of this," I said quietly. Adrian glanced at the headstone again and shook his head gently. "He would not have," he replied. "Your father did not help me because he expected a reward. He helped me because that was the man he chose to be." Every day the wind moved through the cemetery again, carrying the faint scent of fresh grass and distant rain clouds. The 10 men standing around the grave remained still, but now I noticed small details: the way one of them scanned the road beyond the gate, the way another watched the tree line. None of them looked bored. They looked careful, as if the world outside this quiet cemetery might change at any moment. I crossed my arms a little tighter. "You keep saying you protected me," I said, "but my life has been normal. I went to public school, I worked part-time jobs, I paid my own rent." Adrian gave a small nod. "Yes, you did. And that was intentional." I frowned slightly. "Intentional?" Adrian stepped closer to the grave, but kept a respectful distance from me. "The promise I made to your father was not to change your life," he explained. "It was to make sure nothing unfair destroyed it." I studied him silently, and memories began rising slowly in my mind. Moments I had always explained as coincidence: the scholarship that appeared when my college savings fell short, the job offer that arrived the same week my car broke down, the landlord who suddenly decided not to raise the rent after my mother passed away. I had called it luck for years. I swallowed quietly. "Those things." Adrian looked at me again, calm and direct. "Sometimes when the world closes a door," he said, "someone with the ability to open another one should do so." My father believed that I only followed his example. I felt something complicated settle in my chest. Not fear, not gratitude, something deeper, like the realization that my father's kindness had traveled further than I ever imagined. I looked back at the tombstone again and spoke softly. "He helped you for a few minutes on a highway, and you spent 20 years repaying that." Adrian shook his head gently. "Not repaying," he corrected, remembering. He let the words settle between us for a moment before adding quietly, "Kindness should echo, Emily, otherwise the world forgets how to recognize it." I was about to answer when one of the men near the path suddenly turned his head toward the cemetery entrance. His posture shifted only slightly, but it was enough for Adrian to notice. Adrian followed his gaze toward the road beyond the iron gate, and his calm expression grew more focused, not alarmed, just attentive, like someone who had learned to read the small signals others missed. I turned slightly as well and saw a dark vehicle slowing near the entrance to the cemetery. It remained there for a moment, longer than a normal visitor would pause. Then it moved forward again. Slowly Adrian watched it disappear behind a line of trees before speaking again, his voice quiet but firm. "Emily, I need to ask you something simple. Have you noticed anyone unusual around you lately?" I followed Adrian's gaze toward the cemetery entrance and watched the empty road for a few seconds. But nothing unusual happened. The dark vehicle had already disappeared behind the trees, leaving only the quiet sound of wind brushing through the branches. I looked back at him and shook my head slowly. "I do not think so," I said, my voice uncertain. "My life is not very dramatic. I work at a bookstore on Maple Avenue. I go home. I visit my father here once a month." "Nothing about that sounds like something people would watch." Adrian listened carefully, but his expression did not relax the way I expected. "Sometimes the most ordinary lives are the easiest to observe," he said quietly, "especially when someone believes that life might connect to me." The sentence made my chest tighten slightly. "You think someone is watching me because of you?" I asked. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the men standing near the gravel path. One of them gave a small nod, as if confirming something only they understood. Adrian then turned back toward me. "There have been small signs recently," he said, "nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest someone has been asking questions about your father and about you." I felt a strange chill run through my shoulders. "Questions from who?" Adrian exhaled slowly, the way someone does when they are choosing their words carefully. "There are people in my world who believe every debt can be used as leverage, he said. If they discover that I owe something important to someone, they may try to understand what that something is. I frowned slightly. Still trying to understand? You mean they think I am important to you? Adrian looked at me with a calm honesty that felt impossible to ignore. You are important because of the promise I made to your father, he replied, and promises are not small things. Where I come from. I glanced again toward the cemetery gate. The road was quiet again, just a long stretch of pavement leading back toward town. But now that Adrian had mentioned it, I realized there had been a few strange moments over the past few weeks, little things I had brushed off without thinking. There was a car that had parked across the street from the bookstore one afternoon. The driver never came inside. He simply sat there for nearly an hour before leaving. Then there was the time someone called the store asking for me, but hung up the moment I answered the phone. I had assumed it was a wrong number or a bored teenager playing games. But standing here, now those memories felt different. I crossed my arms slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. There have been a few odd things, I admitted. Nothing serious, though. Adrian listened carefully, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if every detail mattered. Odd things are sometimes the first sign that someone is paying attention, he said quietly. One of the men near the path stepped closer and spoke softly to Adrian. I could not hear the exact words, but I noticed Adrian's gaze shift toward the road again. The calm confidence in his posture remained, but something about the atmosphere around us had changed. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet the men around the grave seemed more alert than before. Adrian looked back at me. Emily, he said gently, I do not want to frighten you, but I need you to understand something. The protection I have provided for 20 years was quiet, because no one knew the connection between us. If that connection becomes visible, then the situation changes. I felt my heartbeat grow a little faster. You mean someone might try to reach you through me? Adrian held my gaze for a long moment before answering. Yes, he said simply, and that is why from this moment forward, I will not be protecting you from a distance anymore. The words settled in the cold morning air, and for the first time since arriving at the cemetery, I felt something close to unease move quietly through my thoughts. Not panic, just the slow realization that the calm life I believed I understood might not be as protected as I once thought. You mean someone will be following me now? I asked. Adrian looked at me steadily. Not following, he said, correcting the idea, gently, staying near enough to make sure nothing reaches you. I let out a small breath and glanced around the cemetery again. The place suddenly felt different. The peaceful rows of gray stones, the tall trees swaying in the wind, the quiet road beyond the iron gate, everything looked the same, but my understanding of it had changed. 20 years you protected me without ever stepping into my life, I said slowly, and now suddenly everything changes. Adrian nodded, because now someone might be paying attention to the same story I have been quietly guarding for years. He paused before continuing. When something valuable becomes visible, people begin to look for ways to reach it. I looked back toward the road again, imagining the dark vehicle that had slowed near the gate only minutes earlier. It might have been nothing, a visitor lost on the way to another grave, but the thought refused to leave my mind. What happens now? I asked. Adrian stepped slightly to the side, allowing the wind to move through his coat as he considered the question first. Nothing dramatic, he said calmly. You will continue living your life. You will go to work. You will visit places you normally visit, and you will not change your routine unless I ask you to do so. The way he said it sounded less like a request and more like a carefully planned decision. I crossed my arms and studied him again. You already thought about this? Adrian gave a small nod. I think about many things before they become problems, he said quietly. That is how I have kept your life peaceful for 2 decades. One of the men standing near the path approached again, this time speaking a little longer in a low voice. Adrian listened carefully, then nodded once before the man stepped back to his position. I watched the exchange with curiosity. Do they report everything to you? I asked. Adrian almost smiled. Everything that matters, he replied. I looked down at my father's grave again, the lilies resting beside the white rose, and for a moment the strange situation felt strangely connected to the man who raised me. My father believed in simple actions, helping a stranger, fixing a broken engine, offering advice to someone who needed it. He never imagined that one quiet moment on a roadside would echo for 20 years through a world he never belonged to. I knelt down slightly, adjusting the flowers so they rested more evenly against the stone, my voice softer. When I spoke again, my father would probably tell you that you have already repaid the debt. Adrian watched me carefully before answering. Perhaps he would, he said, but promises are not measured only by time. Sometimes they are measured by the moment when they are truly needed. I stood again, brushing a small piece of grass from my coat, and looked toward the road beyond the cemetery. The morning sun was climbing higher now, light touching the tops of the trees. The world outside seemed ordinary. Cars would be driving through town, people would be buying coffee, the bookstore would open in less than 2 hours. My life was still waiting for me out there. Adrian followed my gaze and spoke calmly. I will have someone nearby today. He said you will not notice them, but they will notice everything around you. I nodded slowly, still adjusting to the idea, and started to say something else, when a faint sound drifted from the road outside the cemetery, the low hum of an engine slowing again near the iron gate. Adrian's eyes shifted instantly toward the entrance, and the men around us straightened slightly, not alarmed, but focused. The same dark vehicle had returned. The low hum of the engine drifted through the cemetery again, and this time there was no mistaking it. The same dark vehicle had returned to the iron gate. I saw Adrian notice it at the exact same moment. His expression did not change, but the atmosphere around him sharpened in a quiet way, like the air before rain. One of the men near the gravel path lifted his hand slightly, and the others adjusted their positions without speaking. None of it looked dramatic, no sudden movement, no raised voices, just calm precision. I turned toward the entrance, trying to see more clearly. The vehicle remained outside the gate for several seconds, longer than any visitor usually would. The tinted windows reflected the morning sunlight, making it impossible to see who sat inside. My chest felt tight with a strange curiosity. Is that the same car from earlier? I asked. Adrian did not take his eyes off the road. Yes, he replied quietly, his voice steady, but more focused now. The vehicle idled for another moment before slowly moving past the gate again, disappearing down the road that curved behind the line of tall maple trees. The sound of the engine faded, but the attention of the men around us did not. Adrian finally shifted his gaze back toward me. It may be nothing, he said calmly, but people who return twice to the same quiet place usually have a reason. I folded my arms against the cool air and glanced again toward the road. I have never seen that car before, I said. Adrian nodded, as if he expected that answer. Then he looked toward one of the men standing near the cars and gave a small signal. The man stepped away, immediately walking toward the gate with quiet confidence. Are you sending him to follow it? I asked. Adrian answered without hesitation, yes. I watched the man disappear beyond the entrance and realized how quickly the peaceful visit to my father's grave had turned into something far more complicated. The cemetery had always been a place where memories felt safe, a quiet patch of ground where nothing unexpected ever happened. But now every small sound seemed louder, the wind moving through the branches, the distant call of birds, the faint crunch of gravel beneath shoes. Adrian turned his attention back to the tombstone for a moment, his eyes resting on my father's name. Daniel Carter, he said softly, your father believed that small actions could shape the future in ways people never see. I followed his gaze to the stone and nodded slowly. He used to say that kindness travels further than we think. Adrian allowed a faint, thoughtful smile at that. Then he spoke again, and sometimes it travels into places people never intended. I stood quietly beside him, the lilies and the white rose resting together against the marble. The sunlight had grown brighter, now warming the tops of the stones around us. Yet the calm moment felt fragile, like something that might break if the world outside the cemetery pushed too close. After a few seconds, I looked back at Adrian. You said someone might be asking questions about me. I said, if they are trying to reach you through me, what do they want? Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the road once more, as if measuring something invisible, before finally speaking. Sometimes people believe that a promise is a weakness. He said they think if they pressure the right person, the promise will break. I felt my stomach tighten slightly. But you do not seem worried. Adrian's expression returned to the same calm certainty I had noticed since the moment he arrived. I am not worried, he replied, because the promise will not break. Before I could respond, the man who had walked to the gate earlier reappeared, moving quickly, but without panic. He approached Adrian and spoke quietly, just a few short words. Adrian listened, and then nodded once slowly. When Adrian looked back at me, his voice was calm, but the meaning behind it carried weight. The vehicle is still nearby, he said, and whoever is inside it has decided to stay in this area for a while. The words from Adrian's man settled into the quiet air around the grave. The vehicle is still nearby, and whoever is inside it has decided to stay in this area for a while. The sentence sounded calm, but the meaning behind it carried weight. I watched Adrian carefully, expecting some visible reaction, but his expression remained steady, the same controlled calm that had surrounded him since the moment he arrived at the cemetery. Do you think they are watching us right now? I asked. Adrian looked toward the road again for a brief moment before answering. Possibly, he said, But if they are, then they are learning something important. I frowned slightly. What is that? Adrian turned his attention back to me, and his voice remained quiet but confident. That promises do not disappear. When someone tries to observe them, the wind moved softly across the cemetery, brushing through the tall trees, and across the rows of gray stones the sunlight had climbed higher, now warming the ground around us. Yet the calm of the place felt different than it had earlier. The peaceful silence now carried a sense of awareness, like the entire space was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. I crossed my arms lightly and looked again at my father's name carved into the marble. Daniel Carter, the man who had believed kindness was the simplest rule in life. It was strange to think that a moment of kindness on a roadside decades ago could still ripple forward into a morning like this one. My father probably never imagined that the stranger he helped would one day stand here protecting his daughter. I glanced toward Adrian again. If someone really is watching, then what happens next? I asked. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped slightly closer to the grave and adjusted the white rose so it rested more securely against the stone. The gesture was small, but respectful, as if the promise he carried had never been treated casually. What happens next? He repeated quietly. Then he looked toward the cemetery gate again. They watch, he said, and we continue living our lives. I studied his face, trying to understand how someone could remain so calm in a moment like this. You make it sound simple. Adrian allowed a faint, thoughtful expression. Sometimes the best response is the one that refuses to change, he said. If someone expects fear or panic, then calm becomes the strongest answer. One of the men near the path spoke softly into a small device near his collar, his voice too low for me to hear clearly. A few seconds later, another man near the cars gave a small nod. Adrian noticed both movements, but did not react dramatically. Everything about the situation remained quiet, controlled, almost invisible to anyone passing by. I looked again toward the road beyond the iron gate. The vehicle was not visible from where we stood, but knowing it was somewhere nearby made the world feel slightly smaller. Do they know who I am? I asked. Adrian considered the question for a moment before answering. They likely know your name, he said. But understanding a person requires more than information. It requires time, observation, and patience. I let out a slow breath. Then I guess they will not find much excitement in my life. Adrian's eyes softened slightly. That depends on how they interpret what they see, he replied. Because sometimes the most ordinary person becomes important simply because of the promise someone else made. I looked down at the flowers resting at the base of my father's grave again, the lilies I brought and the white rose Adrian placed beside them, two small symbols of a moment that had connected two very different worlds 20 years earlier. After a few quiet seconds, I finally spoke again. If someone is trying to reach you through me, I said softly, then they should understand something. Adrian looked at me with calm curiosity. What is that? I met his gaze steadily. My father did not help you because he was afraid of the world. He helped you because he believed the world could still be good. Adrian studied my face for a moment and then gave a small nod as if he recognized the truth in those words. Before either of us spoke again, the man who had followed the vehicle earlier returned through the cemetery gate, walking with the same controlled pace. He approached Adrian and spoke quietly, only a few words, but the meaning in Adrian's eyes changed slightly. When he heard them, Adrian looked back toward me and said, the driver has not left the area, and now we know something else about them. They were not here by accident. The quiet words from Adrian lingered in the air after he said the driver was not here by accident, and for a moment none of us spoke. The cemetery felt unusually still, as if even the wind had decided to listen. I looked again toward the road beyond the iron gate, but the dark vehicle remained hidden somewhere beyond the curve of the trees. Yet knowing it was there changed the weight of the morning entirely. The peaceful visit I had planned for my father had slowly turned into something that felt larger than either of us. I folded my arms lightly and tried to steady my thoughts. So someone came here looking for a connection, I said. Adrian nodded, once not dramatically, just a calm acknowledgement. Yes, he said, and now they know the connection exists. I glanced at the grave again, the lilies and the white rose resting quietly together against the marble stone. My father had always believed that actions mattered more than explanations. He would probably have told me that the best way to face uncertainty was simply to keep standing where you belonged. I let out a slow breath and looked back at Adrian. Then I guess hiding will not solve anything. Adrian studied me carefully for a moment, and something almost approving crossed his expression. Your father raised you well, he said quietly, because that is exactly right. The man who had followed the vehicle earlier stepped closer again, speaking a few calm words to Adrian before returning to his position. The exchange was quick, but clear enough for me to understand that the situation outside the cemetery was still being watched. Adrian turned his attention back to me and spoke in the same steady tone he had used since the beginning. Emily, today you will return to your normal routine. You will go to work, you will greet customers, you will live your life exactly as you always have. I nodded slowly, still adjusting to the strange reality that my quiet bookstore job now existed somewhere within the shadow of a promise made 20 years ago. And the people watching you, I asked. Adrian answered without hesitation, they will continue observing, because that is what curious people do, but observation does not give them power unless they discover something valuable. I glanced once more toward the distant road. The morning sun was bright now, lighting the tops of the cemetery stones and warming the grass beneath our feet. My father used to say that life rarely warns you before something important changes. He believed those moments arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary days. I looked down at the engraved name on the stone one last time before speaking softly. He helped a stranger one night on a highway and never expected anything in return. Adrian followed my gaze and nodded. Yes, he did, and that choice shaped more than he could have imagined. I let the silence sit between us for a few seconds, then I finally asked the question that had been waiting in my mind since the moment Adrian first spoke about the promise. If someone is trying to use me to reach you, then what will you do? Adrian looked toward the road again, his expression calm but certain, the same certainty that had guided every word he had spoken since arriving here. I will do what I promised your father, he said simply. I will make sure his kindness is never turned into a weakness. The wind moved softly through the trees again, and somewhere beyond the cemetery a car engine started in the distance. Adrian glanced briefly toward the sound before returning his attention to me and speaking one final sentence before the moment ended. They may think they discovered a secret today, he said quietly, but what they really discovered is something far more difficult: to break a promise that has already lasted 20 years.